What it do? Luke here. Back in the 90s, Nintendo and Sega were understanding that cartridges were becoming outdated and that they needed to move on to CD gaming. What fools. This is the story on how Nintendo created the greatest gaming competitor by sheer pettiness. Back when the Sega Genesis and the Super Nintendo were the two biggest gaming competitors, Nintendo and Sega both wanted to try and up their game by creating CD add-ons for their consoles. By switching over to CD-based gaming, game developers would be given so much more room to work with when coming up with the games. And so they went off and attempted to create these add-ons. In the end, the Genesis created their very own CD add-on called the Sega CD. This would be something that could be hooked up directly to the Sega Genesis and had its own gaming catalog with games such as Sonic CD and Echo Tides of Time. Unfortunately for Sega though, the Sega CD failed tremendously. As for Nintendo and the events that took place with their CD add-on, it's a completely different story. See, Nintendo wanted to outsource for this project, so they turned to Sony to help them develop the CD-ROM. This is where things get a little bit tricky. Nintendo approached Sony to create an add-on that's large enough to slip the entire Super Nintendo system into. So Sony did what they could to create a Super Nintendo system that had a working slot to place cartridge games, but also reserved a spot in the front to insert CDs. Sony went as far as finishing a prototype for this system before finding out that Nintendo had gone against their backs and partnered with one of their biggest competitors, Philips, to essentially make the same thing Sony just made for them. So now the deal was off between Sony and Nintendo, and they decided that Nintendo can have whatever Philips was making for them. So instead of taking this as a loss, Sony decided to re-engineer what they had made for Nintendo and use that towards the next generation of consoles. Oh yeah, did I forget to mention the name of this console? What Nintendo missed out on was the Nintendo PlayStation, and instead got the Sony PlayStation as a competitor. Sony decided to scrap the idea of using cartridges at all, and exclusively went as a CD-based console that primarily utilized 3D polygon graphics over the traditional 2D pixel art. Now as for Nintendo, things got a little bit out of hand. The Philips and Nintendo collaboration was meant to be a new console instead of just an add-on which would end up being the CDI. This console is notorious for giving Nintendo fans some of the worst gaming experiences of all time, as well as horrendous cutscenes.
It is written, only Link can defeat Ganon.
Great! I'll grab my stuff!
There is no time. Your sword is enough.
How about a kiss? For luck?
You've got to be kidding.
So now you see Nintendo drop the ball heavily. What was meant to be an upgrade for the Super Nintendo ended up being a monstrosity that sparked the creation of a new rival. But the CDI isn't the rival of the PlayStation. This is. The Nintendo 64, such a great system. The competition for this generation of consoles was the Nintendo 64 and the Sony PlayStation, and the Sega Saturn, which is honestly not worth mentioning. This is where Sega had a huge downfall and lost a lot of their customers. So in reality, the only competition this generation was really the N64 and the PlayStation. So this is where it happened. Gaming's big jump to 3D. While over on the PlayStation, Sony gave customers games such as Crash Bandicoot and Spyro the Dragon, Nintendo was capable of pleasing their already existing fan base. Since this was Sony's first generation in the gaming market, there weren't existing fans for Crash or Spyro, but there were tons of people eager to see what Nintendo was going to do with titles such as The Legend of Zelda and Mario next. And so Nintendo gave us some of the greatest games of all time, this being games such as Mario 64, The Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time, Star Fox 64, Smash 64, and the list goes on. This is something I always found charming about the system, the way they named their games. Most titles include the number 64 in the name, not because they were the 64th entry in the series, but it was a way of saying, hey, I belong to this system and this system exclusively. The console itself is once again cartridge-based, but what made it stick out from the PlayStation and the Sega Saturn is the fact that instead of being a 32-bit console, it is actually a 64-bit system, making it more powerful than anyone in its competition. So now we know what the 64 stands for at least. Looking back at the system, its controller is one of the most bizarre and unique things I've ever seen. The button layout plus the fact that it was designed for aliens with 3 arms. The 3 prongs always confused me, like, is there a specific way we're supposed to hold this thing, or is it meant to display that there isn't one right way to hold it? Compare this to the PlayStation controller, and you'll notice that it looks like the Super Nintendo controller but with added grips. This really displays how this was originally meant to be a Nintendo console, because this controller feels more like the evolution of controllers where Nintendo was going. But then again, Nintendo has been notorious for having the most out-of-line controller evolutions ever. Now that we know how these consoles were made, as well as the reputation that followed them, along with some information on how they released, how did they do in sales? In short, the PlayStation killed it this generation. While the Nintendo 64 sold a measly 32 million units, the PlayStation was a massive success with a whopping 102 million units sold. And well, I guess then there's also the Sega Saturn. The best explanation as to why this happened is that while Nintendo had some of the greatest games ever made on the 64, they were mostly just Nintendo developed games. Third-party developers decided to work with Sony on the PlayStation due to having a disc drive, since it was much easier to work with over cartridges. Because of the CD drive on the PlayStation, Nintendo lost franchises such as Final Fantasy to Sony, which by the way, Final Fantasy VII on the PS1 is also looked back on as one of the greatest games ever made. When it comes to quality games, I'll still say that Nintendo 64 would win in that category. But for a kid that grows up in the 90s, I can see why they choose the PS1 considering the more diverse catalog spanning a multitude of developers. And this is how Nintendo inadvertently created their most vigorous competitor. Console wars have always been something I've been enamored with. Even all the way back in middle school, I remember arguing with kids saying that the Xbox One was better than the PS4, and nowadays people are making the same argument with modern day consoles. Console wars will always be a thing, whether it's the 80s and early 90s with Sega and Nintendo, or the late 90s with Nintendo and Sony, or even the early 2000s with Microsoft and Sony. The only thing you can learn from these wars is that you should probably not make your own competition.